I can't quite shake the sound of that old train whistle, even now, sitting on this weathered porch where the wood creaks under my boots. It's been 63 years since that night in South Georgia, but every so often the memory drifts back like smoke through the pines, curling around my thoughts until I can't see straight. I remember that humid summer air, thick as molasses, clinging to my shirt, and the scent of magnolia blossoms drifting down from Mrs. Crawford's yard next door. I was 19 then, a quiet kid who'd rather read dime novels than get into scraps at the feed store. But something about that night turned my whole world upside down. It was late, just past the hour when the fireflies start blinking in the field, and I was heading home from Joe Ellis's shop, where I'd been helping him fix his stubborn tractor. The moon was just a sliver in the sky, barely lighting the dirt road that led past the old railroad crossing. I can still hear those rails clacking under empty boxcars, like the steady heartbeat of a restless soul. And then, silence. Except for Joe, lying cold beside his wrench, the darkness hiding what had really happened. You know, folks, if this tale's reaching you, why not give it a thumbs up, share your thoughts down below, and subscribe for the next chapter? It doesn't cost much, but it sure helps an old man know he's not talking to the breeze. After that, it was confusion and whispers. Word spread through that tiny town faster than wildfire. They found Joe Ellis shot dead. And just like that, suspicion fell on me. Me, the shy mechanic's helper with mud on his boots and grease under his fingernails. I'd never raised a hand against anyone, but a boy with a kind face and big dreams is still a convenient target when folks need someone to blame. That's when I tucked the first piece of that memory deep inside, a seed of doubt sprouting into shame. Because when your own brother smiles and wraps an arm around your shoulder while all eyes are on you, you start to believe his lies, even if they're colder than that midnight air. Tonight, I'm 85, and every wrinkle on this face tells part of the story I couldn't tell back then. I'm a Vietnam vet, a man who saw more than a share of sorrow, but nothing pierced me quite like that night in '62. I've spent a lifetime under the weight of unspoken truths I thought would always stay buried in my heart. And yet, here I sit, with the scent of magnolias still drifting in my mind, knowing that the real story is waiting to be told. These memories won't let me rest, not until the whole world hears what really happened on that dusty road by the railroad crossing. So lean in a little closer, friend, because I'm about to take you back in time, to the sound of a train whistle, the weight of a nameless fear, and the moment when a young man's life was forever changed. Back then, life moved at its own gentle pace, like the slow drip of molasses off a spoon on a Sunday morning, and that little town in South Georgia felt as safe as a cradle in Grandma's arms. I was barely a teenager, 16, maybe, but I carried myself with the pride of someone who thought the world was bound to play fair, and goodness was the coin everyone traded. The air was thick with the smell of honeysuckle and fresh-cut hay, and every dawn broke with the distant clang of the feed store bell and the lowing of cattle out past the railroad tracks. Mama would be standing by the kitchen window, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, humming an old hymn as she poured coffee into chipped cups for me and Bobby, who was already itching for adventure beyond the county line. Daddy's Ford pickup sat in the driveway, its hood open like a wide grin, and I'd spend Saturday afternoons elbow deep in grease, learning how to coax more power out of that engine than it knew it had. In the evenings, neighbors would drift over, Mr. Thompson with his fiddle, Miss Ada with her sweet potato pie, and we'd sit on the porch, sharing stories until the fireflies blinked us into silence. I believed in simple truths, that a man's handshake was as good as his word, and that kindness would circle back to you sooner or later. I held tight to those beliefs, even when Bobby teased me for my daydreams of college, saying I was chasing fairy tales. But I saw myself leaving that dusty road one day, diploma in hand, promising to send money home for Mama's comfort and maybe even take her on a trip to see the ocean. Since she'd never left the state, my world was small, just 2 churches, a 5 and 10 store with candy jars at the counter, and the rhythmic click-clack of freight trains, but it felt infinite in its possibilities. I spent lazy afternoons fishing in the creek with my best friend, whose laughter echoed louder than any locomotive horn, and I scribbled poetry in a faded notebook, convinced I'd make folks smile with words someday. The townsfolk would tip their hats when they saw me, patting me on the shoulder with a proud grin, and I soaked it all in like sunshine on bare skin. Nights were for stargazing, lying on the hood of that old Ford, pointing out constellations, and I'd swear I could hear Bobby's future calling my name, urging me toward horizons I couldn't yet see. In that golden haze of youth, I believed people always told the truth and a brother's bond was unbreakable. We were inseparable, me, the quiet dreamer, and Bobby, the charmer with a laugh that could light up any room. We planned our futures in hushed tones under the porch light. He'd start a business, I'd teach at a local school, and together we'd build something that'd make Mama beam. Those nights, I was full of hope, certain the world would turn out just fine. I never imagined that one mistake or one man's envy could shatter all that faith. But every time I close my eyes now, I drift back to those simpler days, to the creak of the screen door and the hum of crickets, and I feel the ache of innocence lost before its time. And though I was only a boy back then, I carried in my heart the weight of dreams too heavy for my young shoulders, not knowing that the real test of character would come far sooner than I ever pictured. I still remember the day she walked into my life like a warm breeze on an April morning, Mary Ellen Crawford, with her straw hat tipped just so, and a laugh that sounded like church bells on a Sunday. I was 17, leaning against my daddy's old Ford in front of the 5 and 10, wiping grease off my hands, when she and her ma stopped by to buy a jar of penny candy. I'd seen her around town, everybody did, but that was the first time our eyes really met, and I swear my heart skipped a beat so loud I thought folks might hear it over the clack of the passing freight train. I couldn't explain why I felt both calm and alive all at once. One moment I was just the quiet kid who stuck to his wrenches and books, and the next I was stumbling over my words, offering to help carry her parcels home. Mary Ellen smiled, and that was all it took, her blue eyes crinkling at the corners as though she'd known me all my life. From then on, I'd find any excuse to walk past her porch, to tip my hat and say, "Morning, Miss Mary Ellen," even if she was hanging laundry or feeding her chickens. In those moments, I felt like the center of the universe, certain that kindness and a genuine smile could build bridges stronger than any railroad trestle. It was pure, teenage wonder, simple yet profound, and I believed, with every fiber of my being, that this was what life was meant to offer. Unexpected joy when you least expected it. But of course, nothing stays that perfect. Bobby noticed us too, and his teasing started gentle, careful now. Little brother's got a new shine in his eye, but it grew sharper over time. I saw it in the way he'd stand beside me but never touch me, in the flash of something like envy when Mary Ellen waved back to me one afternoon. I didn't want to think badly of my own brother. He was my hero, after all, but that day, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky pink, I caught him watching me with an intensity I'd never seen before. I remember my pulse racing, not with excitement this time, but with a sudden, uneasy panic that maybe everything I held dear could unravel at any moment. And right then, I understood that this innocent spark of first love carried a price, the fragile balance between brotherly affection and something darker, something that would change all our lives in ways I couldn't yet imagine. Little did I know that simple meeting by the 5 and 10 would set in motion a chain of events stretching from stolen kisses behind the churchyard fence to whispered accusations in the dead of night. But in that heady, hopeful moment, swept up in the throes of young love, I felt only one thing, a fierce certainty that Mary Ellen and I belonged together, and that no shadow, no matter how ominous, could ever touch what we had. It was a feeling so powerful, I tucked it away in my heart like a precious keepsake, never knowing that someday I'd rummage through that same heart, searching for courage to speak truths long buried beneath fear and old regrets. Can still feel that first knot of dread twisting in my gut when word came down that Joe Ellis had been found on his back in the workshop, a crimson stain blooming across his denim shirt like a rose cut open in the heat. It was early evening, the cicadas droning in the pines, and I'd been tightening a bolt on old man Henderson's tractor when Bobby came barreling up the dirt road, face pale as moonlight. He didn't have to speak. His eyes said it all, and in that moment, the world I knew splintered into shadows. Folks gathered on the front porch of Mrs. Claiborne's house, voices low and tense, casting glances my way as if I carried that bullet in my pocket. My mother clutched her apron so tight her knuckles went white, refusing to meet my gaze, and Daddy looked at me as though I'd traded my own blood for someone else's. I wanted to scream that I'd been at the diner when it happened, that my wrench had never left my hand, but a lump lodged in my throat thicker than the molasses we'd had for supper. Instead, I stood there, silent, while Bobby's hand gripped my shoulder, his grip cold, almost accusatory, and the weight of a town's suspicion settled on my shoulders like a yoke. I couldn't shake the feeling that every neighbor who tipped their hat to me now did so with a hidden question. Did you do it? I felt alone, abandoned by the brother I'd always trusted, and more alone than I'd ever been even under the heaviest artillery fire in Nam. Fear gnawed at me day and night, a relentless hunger that hollowed out my confidence and left me uncertain whom to trust. I'd spent my youth believing that family was the bedrock of truth, but watching Bobby offer a tight smile to Mr. Clayton as he said, "I can't imagine how any man do such a thing," I realized that blood ties could be as fragile as a spider's web. Shame crept in like a slow-moving fog, making me replay every moment I'd spent with Joe Ellis, every shared laugh over a busted carburetor, wondering if I'd missed a sign, a sliver of ill will. I lay awake on that creaking bed frame, the ceiling fan slicing the humid air above me, and prayed until my voice echoed back empty promises. I prayed for courage to speak, for evidence to clear my name, but most of all I prayed that Bobby would stand by me, that he'd remember the nights we lay under the stars and vowed we'd look out for each other no matter what. Instead, he drifted away, slipping into the background of whispered conversations and sympathetic nods meant for my parents. The little world I'd built, work at the shop, evenings on the porch, dreams of college, and a life beyond those railroad tracks, crumbled in the span of a heartbeat. Questions buzzed in my mind like angry hornets. Should I fight the accusations and risk tearing my family apart? Should I swallow my pride and stay quiet, hoping the truth might emerge on its own? Or was I doomed to carry this mark of suspicion forever, haunted by a crime I didn't commit and betrayed by the one person I thought I could trust? That conflict gnawed at me more fiercely than any external scorn, for it wasn't just the townsfolk I was up against, it was my own blood, my brother, and the fear that the man who'd stood by my side since childhood was now the very reason I felt so lost. And so I stayed silent, trapped between the love I bore him and the injustice ripping at my soul, not yet knowing that this sacrifice of my own voice would set the stage for secrets even darker than the night I first heard that gunshot. I remember that day like it was etched into my bones, the courthouse doors swinging open with a hollow thud that echoed louder than any train whistle I'd ever heard. I walked in beside my father, shoulders hunched, breath coming in shallow pulls, as though every step were measured by the weight of a noose around my neck. The room was hot and still, sunlight slicing through dusty windows and sharp beams, illuminating the rows of stiff-backed chairs and the solemn faces staring back at me. Then I saw him, Bobby, sitting on the witness stand, his hands gripping the rail so tight his knuckles turned white. I swear, in that moment, Tom stopped. It was as if the old clock behind the judge's bench had frozen, its pendulum caught mid-swing, and the whole world held its breath waiting for one simple word to shatter the silence. The bailiff called his name, and Bobby rose, towering over me in that wooden box as if he were the judge instead of the accused brother. My heart pounded so loud I feared it might burst free of my chest, and I fought the urge to yell, "You promised you'd stand by me." But my voice caught in my throat like a knot I couldn't untie. The prosecutor's questions were clinical, sharp as a razor. "Did you see your brother near Joe Ellis's shop that night?" Bobby's lips curled into a measured smile, his eyes steady on mine. "I did," he said, and the single syllable felt like a knife twisting in my gut. I saw my father's face slacken, my mother's hand flutter to her mouth, and I wanted to collapse right there in the wooden pew, to beg Bobby to tell the truth, to say, "No, you lied. You know I didn't do it." But the words never came. When the defense attorney pressed him, asking why he'd point the finger at his own brother, Bobby's answer cut deeper than any bullet, "Because I had to do what was right for this town and for my family's honor." I felt my world split open then, the innocence I'd carried like a shield crumbling into dust. Every memory of our shared childhood, the creek fishing, the whispered dreams under the porch light, tumbled away, leaving me standing naked before a jury of strangers who already saw me as a murderer. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I blinked them back, swallowing the sting, because if I cried then, I knew I'd never find the strength to stand. And all the while, Bobby's testimony wound around me like barbed wire, each word tightening the noose of guilt I didn't deserve. I realized in that instant that my brother, the one I'd followed into mischief and hoped to follow into manhood, had betrayed me more utterly than any enemy could. When he finally stepped down from the stand, the judge's gavel came down with a hollow echo, and the jury filed out, leaving me with nothing but the shadows of a life I once believed would be my own. I walked out of that courtroom a different man, stripped of faith and blood ties, haunted by the echo of Bobby's voice declaring me guilty. I had lost more than my freedom that day. I lost the brother I thought I knew, the safety of home, and the certainty that kindness would always prevail. I realized then that some wounds run deeper than flesh, and that a man can be broken, not by a bullet, but by the betrayal of the one he loved most. I didn't speak for months after that day. Words felt brittle on my tongue, like splinters waiting to catch on my teeth. I left the shop to Mr. Henderson and spent my mornings wandering those same dusty streets where once I tipped my hat to friends, now greeted only by wary glances and doors closing a moment too soon. The clack of the railroad crossing sounded hollow, as if the iron rails themselves had lost their conviction, and every freight whistle carried a mournful note that matched the ache in my chest. I drifted from one empty room to another in our family home, the walls heavy with memories I couldn't bear to face, Mama's hymn humming through the back door at church supper, Daddy's roar of laughter over a well-earned paycheck, Bobby's teasing grin as we raced home from the fields. In their place was a stillness so thick it pressed into my bones, and I felt as though I'd been excised from time itself, the ghost-haunting ground I once called mine. Nights were the worst, darkness echoing the void inside me, and I found myself returning to the porch where I first heard that gunshot, sitting under a sky full of stars that felt indifferent to my sorrow. I tried to pray, to find solace in scriptures I'd learned as a boy, but my faith had cracked under the weight of injustice. The words of consolation slipped through my hands like water. I questioned every belief I'd held. Was there justice in a world where a good man's life could be stolen and a brother's life could carry him free? I felt abandoned by God, by family, and by the very ground I stood on. Day by day, I eked out a living doing odd jobs, mending fences for Mr. Clayton, painting Mrs. Harper's porch, carrying groceries for Miss Ada, each task a reminder that my hands, once skilled at coaxing engines to life, were now too gentle, too broken, to grip anything with purpose. Townspeople nodded in passing, but their eyes held sorrow tinged with relief, as though they pitied me more for my silence than for the loss I'd endured. I'd rise before dawn, sketching aimless lines in a battered journal, hoping the motion might coax some spark of meaning back into me, but the page stared back empty, mirroring my own emptiness. In the afternoons, I'd sit by the creek, where Bobby and I once cast our hopeful lines, and watch the water carry fallen leaves downstream, each one slipping away as though to show me that nothing, not even grief, could ever be held in one place. Sometimes a woman's voice would drift across the field, Miss Mary Ellen, now Mrs. Thompson, passing with her baskets of eggs, and my heart would tighten with what-ifs I could no longer afford. I realized then that the boy who believed in kindness and the power of truth had died on that porch in '62, buried beneath the weight of silence he'd chosen for fear of shattering whatever remained of his world. Time trudged on, indefinite and gray, and I felt myself becoming a stranger in my own life. The rhythm of days and nights blurred into one perpetual twilight, and I longed for something, anything, to stir me back to feeling. In that void, I discovered a strange clarity. The lie that bound me so tightly had left space where my old self used to be. It was a painful vacancy, but it was mine, untainted by innocence lost or promises broken. And though I couldn't yet speak the truths lodged inside me, I began to learn how to sit with the ache, to honor the loss without letting it define my every breath. Eventually, I found work rebuilding the church pews that had witnessed my family's prayers, sanding away decades of grime until the wood shone like new. With each stroke of the plane, I felt something healing, a cautious hope that maybe, just maybe, The scars of the past could be smoothed enough to carry a future. I still wake to the same train whistle, older now, my shoulders less tense, my voice rough but ready. The silence taught me that sometimes retreat is necessary, that loss can be a teacher as much as a wound. And though the world has changed, and I along with it, I've carried on, step by quiet step, learning that in the aftermath of a storm, even the driest ground can catch a seed of truth and bring forth something worth living for. I'll never forget the morning I bumped into little Sarah Jenkins down by the creek, that day when the world felt too heavy even to lift my head off the pillow. I was on my way to the old church workshop to sand another pew when I heard her crying, a soft, shaky sound that pulled me from my thoughts like a lifeline. She dropped her mother's locket in the water, that tiny gold heart they say holds every whispered prayer you ever made. I could see the weight of worry pressing on her small shoulders, and something in me stirred, an echo of the boy who once believed kindness was the strongest force on earth. I rolled up my sleeves, waded into the cool shallows, and felt the smooth stones under my boots as I fished around until the locket glinted in my palm. When I held it out to her, her eyes lit up like fireflies at dusk, and she hugged me so tight I almost felt her tears dampen my coat. That moment felt like a spark striking flint, and I realized I hadn't felt hope like that in years. From then on, mornings didn't weigh me down so much. Instead of dragging myself into the workshop, I found myself waking with a quiet grin, remembering how Sarah's face brightened when she saw her locket again. It reminded me that even the smallest deed, a rescued trinket, a kind word, could ripple outward, touching hearts you'd never dreamed. I started volunteering at the Veterans Hall on Wednesday afternoons, teaching fellas how to paint watercolors. I'd never held a brush like that before, but it didn't matter. The strokes were messy and honest, and we laughed at the colors bleeding together like memories that don't fit neatly into lines. I saw men who'd carried burdens far heavier than mine soften when they reminisced about home, and I realized we were all just souls searching for a way back to ourselves after life knocked us off course. One evening, Mrs. Thompson, Mary Ellen's daughter, stopped by the workshop, her eyes warm with gratitude. She told me the pews I'd restored had brought new light to the church services, that folks felt closer as they sat there, the smooth wood under their hands, the polished sheen reflecting hope they thought was gone. It struck me then that the same hands that built machines, that fixed engines for decades, could also rebuild community and faith. My heart felt lighter, as though the silence I'd carried had grown cracks wide enough for sunshine to seep in. I found myself asking to help with Sunday school lessons, telling stories of resilience, about a young man who lost everything but found purpose in lifting others. The children would listen with wide eyes, as if they believed every word, and I loved seeing their earnest faces hanging on each line. In those moments, I discovered a new meaning, that my own healing was tied up in the healing of others. No longer was I merely surviving the rust of old memories. I was forging a path forward, one act of care at a time. The world hadn't changed overnight. The railroad whistle still sounded mournful, and I still felt the shadow of 62 flicker through my thoughts. But I knew I wasn't alone in facing it. I had Sarah's grateful smile, the veteran painter's laughter, and the warm glow of the church lamps guiding me back to a life worth living. And so I pressed on, each day a small step toward rebuilding the self I thought lost, learning that even the hardest winters give way to spring when you hold fast to hope and reach out a hand to pull someone else back from the water. I stood in the fading light of that old workshop one evening, watching the dust motes dance in a beam of golden sun, and I felt something shift inside me, like the last link in a heavy chain snapping free. For years I'd carried the weight of silence as if it were my penance, letting the past define each breath I drew, each wrench I turned. But in that quiet moment, surrounded by the tools I'd trusted all my life, I made a choice. I would no longer let the shadows of 62 steal another heartbeat from my days. I reached down and picked up the faded photograph of Bobby and me, young boys grinning shyly at the camera by the creek bank. The edges were bent, and the image was starting to yellow, but our eyes shone with hope, untainted by betrayal or regret. I traced my finger over his face, closing my eyes, and whispered to the empty room, "I forgive you, brother, and I forgive myself." Then, with a deep breath that felt like the first real inhale I'd had in decades, I tucked the photo into the back pocket of my work jeans, where it would stay, not as a source of shame, but as a reminder that even broken bonds can teach us who we are meant to become. Later that night, I opened the ancient wooden box I'd kept hidden under the floorboards, still clutching the pistol and mother's letter, and I laid them out on the workbench. The gun felt heavier than I remembered, cold and accusing, but as I stared at it, I realized it no longer held power over me. It was nothing more than metal and memory, a relic of a sin I didn't commit. I reached up, unscrewed the barrel, and let it clatter into the oil-stained wood. With steady hands, I gathered every piece and carried them outside, beneath the sprawling oak where fireflies flickered like tiny beacons of possibility. I buried the gun deep in the soil, tucking the letter beside it, then covered it with earth and pressed down hard until it felt locked away forever. As I stood there, the cicadas hummed their evening hymn, and a soft breeze stirred the magnolia leaves overhead. It felt like the world was exhaling with me, releasing a breath it had been holding for far too long. In that simple act of letting go, I felt a surge of peace expand through my chest, warming muscles that had grown tight with guilt and sorrow. I knew I couldn't rewrite history, nor could I bring Joe Ellis back or change the choices my brother made. But I could decide how to walk forward, how to let this story shape me not into a victim, but into a man who even in his final years chose compassion over bitterness. The next morning, I rose before dawn and walked the tidy rows of pews I'd restored in the church, laying my hand on each smooth bench. I said a quiet prayer of gratitude, not for absolution, but for the strength to embrace life anew. I offered a silent blessing for Bobby, wherever his soul might rest, hoping that forgiveness might find him too. And as the first rays of sunlight painted the sky in hues of pink and lavender, I felt a gentle conviction settle into my bones that this decision, this act of acceptance, was the true climax of my journey. From that day on, I carried no grudges, only stories to share, moments of kindness to spread, and the knowledge that a man can choose freedom even when the past seems determined to hold him captive. I chose to live on, without rancor or regret, simply stepping forward into each new dawn with a heart unburdened and a spirit unbroken. You know, after all those years, after the creak of that porch floor and the echo of freight whistles, after the silence I carried like a stone in my chest, I've come to understand something simple and unvarnished. Life doesn't promise fairness, but it always offers a choice. I spent decades believing that the world owed me justice, that vindication would heal every wound and erase every sleepless night. Instead, I learned that justice lived in moments of grace, the gentle nod of a neighbor who sees your pain, the clasp of a child's hand trusting you to guide her, the soft glow of sunrise promising another chance to start again. Back in the day, I thought strength meant never showing fear, but real strength is leaning into your own scars and letting them remind you that you survived. I thought forgiveness was for saints and strangers, but it turned out forgiveness is the gift you give yourself so you can stop dragging the past behind you like a broken anchor. And I believed that family was a fortress, only to find that sometimes the greatest betrayals can come from those we love most. What I understand now is that betrayal doesn't define a man unless he lets it. I let my brothers lie burying me for years, but when I chose to forgive him, even in his absence, I freed myself to walk untethered into each new morning. Here's the truth I want you to carry. Waiting for the world to make things right can keep you frozen in place until your bones grow old. The wiser path is to tend the garden of your own heart, pulling out the weeds of anger and planting seeds of hope wherever you can. You might not have the power to change someone else's choices, but you can decide how to let those choices shape your own life. I learned that kindness isn't weakness, it's a kind of courage. It takes more guts to offer a smile when your soul aches, to lend a hand when your back is bent under regret, to speak a word of compassion when silence feels safer. And let me tell you, there's magic in small acts, a rescued locket, a restored peel, a word of encouragement to a fellow veteran. Those gestures ripple outward in ways you'll never fully grasp, stitching the fabric of community back together one thread at a time. I also discovered that truth can be a heavy burden, but it's the clearest path to freedom. Hiding behind lies may shield you for a season, but it poisons the well of your own integrity. It wasn't until I unearthed those buried secrets, the pistol and mother's letter, that I found the courage to reclaim my story. And though opening old wounds hurts, it's the only way to heal them. So, friend, maybe it's your turn to stop waiting for an apology that may never come or proof that will always elude you. Maybe it's time to dig deep, face what you've buried, and lay it to rest on your own terms. Perhaps you've let silence become your prison. I urge you to speak your truth, even if your voice trembles. Perhaps you've held grudges so long they become part of your identity. Consider letting them go and feeling for the first time what it's like to stand unshackled. And if you've ever doubted that a man can choose his destiny, remember this. I was a quiet mechanic's helper with nothing but dreams and a box of memories gathering dust, and I learned that every day offers the power to choose hope over despair, to choose healing over bitterness, and to choose action over regret. That, my friends, is the real lesson of my story, not some lofty moral, but the honest truth that you don't have to wait for the world to make sense. You can decide right now to live with courage, compassion, and the kind of wisdom that comes only when a life has been tested and yet still finds a way to bloom again. Well now, I've brought you along on this long, winding journey through my memories, those nights filled with echoes of freight whistles and mornings brightened by an unexpected act of kindness, and I hope you feel the weight of what I've carried all these years, and the lightness I found in choosing forgiveness over bitterness. I want you to settle into that feeling of warmth when the porch light flickers on and you know somebody's waiting with a story. That sense of trust when a voice through the screen invites you to lean in and share a secret that's been tucked away for far too long. Because this tale isn't just about a boy in South Georgia whose brother framed him for murder in '62, or about an old veteran who buried a pistol and a mother's confession beneath an oak tree. It's about the choices we make every day, how we respond when life betrays us, when love falters, when faith feels lost in the shadows of our own doubts. And it's about you, too. The way your heart might tighten at the thought of someone you trusted letting you down, or how a single kind gesture can plant a seed of hope in the most unexpected place. Tonight, as you sit in your favorite chair, I invite you to ask yourself, do you believe that true love, in all its messy, imperfect glory, ought to find its way back to us, even after the darkest of trials? Is it possible that forgiveness can rebuild what was broken, and that the bonds we thought shattered forever might one day be mended by compassion and understanding? Because I've learned, sometimes through tears, often through quiet perseverance, that the past may shape us, but it doesn't have to imprison us. Every sunrise offers the chance to let go of a grievance, to extend grace where it seems undeserved, to speak a truth that's been muffled by fear. And so I leave you with this. Love isn't a simple promise. It's a living, breathing choice we renew each time we decide to see another person's heart, to hold their faults gently, and to believe in their capacity for change. Sometimes I imagine Mary Ellen walking past that creek, her eyes catching on a glint of sunlight through the magnolia leaves, and I wonder if, in that fleeting moment, she feels the echo of a boy who once stood there with a heart full of hope. I like to think she does, that her memory of me isn't just a whisper in the wind, but a steady refrain in the song of her life. And maybe, just maybe, our paths will cross again in some new chapter, under a different sky, where forgiveness has had time to bloom. Until then, carry this story with you, not as a relic of sorrow, but as a testament to the power of resilience, the healing grace of compassion, and the promise that even the heaviest burdens can be lifted when we choose to forgive. Thank you for listening, for walking this path with me, and for holding a place in your heart for a weary mechanic's helper who found his way back to hope. I'll see you in the next chapter of life, wherever it takes you, and I'll be curious to hear how you believe true love should return to those who've almost given up on it.